mechanism of species changing and splitting over time is random mutation and reproductive success. Now, these different definitions of evolution help us understand disagreements among Christians. Young Earth creationists agree that microevolution happens, but they dispute whether the fossil record shows a pattern of change over a long history. Old Earth progressive creationists say that there really is a pattern of change over a long history in the fossil record, and there may have been some common ancestry, but they dispute the theory of evolution. They say that while God might have used some evolution and common ancestry, he also did some miracles along the way to produce new life forms. Evolutionary creationists say that the theory of evolution really is the best scientific model for the data that we see in God's revelation in nature. They believe that just like God uses natural processes of gravity and nuclear fusion to make the sun shine, so God oversaw and used natural processes like evolution to govern the history of life. All three types of creationists agree that the atheistic claims of evolutionism are wrong. Now, you might be wondering, where does intelligent design fit into all of this? We're often told we have to either pick design or evolution. Either God intelligently designed birds and flowers, or these things evolved. But evolutionary creationists say that both design and evolution could be true. To illustrate, imagine that we have disassembled a watch and put all the tiny parts in this plastic bag. You could shake this bag continuously for years, and the watch would never reassemble itself. The parts fit together beautifully, but they have to be assembled together by hand. Well, young Earth creationists and progressive creationists think about God's design of biological life sort of like this watch. God designed the atoms and molecules and laws of nature to make life possible, but God also miraculously put them together to form flowers and birds. But suppose we design the watch a little differently, so that each part easily catches on to its neighbors. So when two springs or gears that belong together collide together, they snap together and stay together. So if you shake this bag for a few hours, all the pieces come together and the entire watch self-assembles. Now, I don't know if anybody's made a self-assembling watch, but it would be a really clever design, wouldn't it? Evolutionary creationists think about God's design of biological life more like this self-assembling watch. God designed the entire system of biological evolution so cleverly that over time and under God's providential governance, it would fulfill God's desire of filling the earth with a wide variety of plants and animals in a complex web of ecosystems. So a lot of the disagreements among Christians center around common ancestry and the theory of evolution. And as we said earlier, part of our job is to examine that evidence and report back to the church. And it looks to us, along with the vast majority of scientists, that several reinforcing lines of evidence really do strongly support common ancestry and the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin knew about evidence from the fossil record and about anatomical similarities among species and geographical distribution of species. Since Darwin's time, more evidence has been found from developmental biology, genetic diversity within species, and genetic similarities across species. We don't have time to talk about all of those, so I'll just say a bit about the last one. You've probably heard that scientists can compare your DNA with that of your brothers and sisters and tell that you share the same parents. Scientists can do the same sort of thing with the DNA of plants and animals. When they examine the DNA of dogs and coyotes and wolves, they find evidence that they all share a common ancestor that no longer exists. Similarly, they see evidence in DNA that all dogs, cats, and other mammals share a common ancestor even longer ago. In fact, when scientists make a tree of common ancestry just using modern genetic data, they pretty much reconstruct the tree of common ancestry that was made from earlier evidence that Darwin used. So modern genetics is confirming a prediction of the theory of evolution. So scientists have several independent lines of evidence supporting common ancestry and the theory of evolution. There are many books written for non-scientists where you can learn about this evidence and decide for yourself. We devoted chapter 9 of our book to it. Two other recent books written by Christians are The Language of God by Francis Collins, the former head of the Human Genome Project, and Coming to Peace with Science by Darrell Falk, a biology professor at Point Loma Nazarene University. But the really big question is, what about human origins? This Calvin and Hobbes cartoon shows a snowman contemplating snow evolution. As young Calvin says, if snowmen evolved from snowballs, it raises tough theological questions for him. Plant and animal evolution is one thing, but in all seriousness, the theological issues around human origins really are a lot more difficult. There's a variety of views within the church as a whole, so I'll just focus on one denomination. Calvin College is owned by the Christian Reformed Church of North America, which is also the denomination in which I was raised. In 1991, the Synod, the elected ruling body of the denomination, said that Scripture was compatible with multiple views on the age of the earth, but it also appended Statement F, saying that the clear teaching of Scripture and of our confessions on the uniqueness of human beings as image bearers of God rule out the espousal of all theorizing that posits the reality of evolutionary forebearers of the human race. But then, Synod added 2 additional notes. Of course, private research, theorizing, and discussions are not addressed by this declaration, and this declaration is not intended and may not be used to limit further investigation and discussion on the origin of humanity. I think this accurately reflects that Synod of 1991 was divided, like the church as a whole. It strongly affirmed some traditional Christian teachings, but it also said that further discussion must be allowed on the scientific and theological issues. Now, that same year, I began really seriously studying the issue for myself, and by the time I'd read my 6th or 7th book, I realized I wasn't going to find an easy answer. So, for the next few minutes, in the spirit of discussing and not espousing, I'm going to lay out 5 different scenarios on human origins with special emphasis on Adam and Eve. I found it's helpful on these issues, it's almost always helpful to keep in mind multiple different scenarios that Christian scholars have proposed. Now, while these 5 scenarios don't cover all possibilities, I choose them because each one, in different ways, tries to preserve essential Christian doctrines. The first scenario is the traditional one. Adam and Eve were specially created by God, not descended from animal ancestors, about 8,000 years ago, and we are all descended from them. They fell into sin in a single act of disobedience to God. But over the last few decades, paleontologists have discovered fossils and tools of modern-looking humans living in the Americas for more than 10,000 years, and in Asia and Australia for more than 60,000 years, and in Africa going back almost 150,000 years. So a second scenario is to push Adam and Eve back to those first modern-looking human fossils about 150,000 years ago. In this scenario, God used evolution to make plants and animals and even some species that were precursors to humans, but then God miraculously transformed a pair of those precursors into true human beings, and we are all descended from that pair. A third scenario is that Genesis chapter 1 refers to God creating humanity as a species. God used evolution, and the first human beings appeared about 150,000 years ago in Africa. But the Adam and Eve of Genesis chapter 2 lived in Mesopotamia about 8,000 years ago. They are not the ancestors of all humans, but were chosen as special representatives of the rest of humanity. Because they sinned, all humanity fell into sin. Now, in fact, this idea that other humans were around at the same time as Adam and Eve was proposed long before modern science to resolve certain issues raised by Genesis chapters 4 through 11. For example, who was Cain's wife, and how did all those cities get built so quickly in a few generations after Adam and Eve? A fourth scenario pushes back this pair of individuals, our representatives, Adam and Eve, to around 150,000 years ago at the dawn of humanity. Adam and Eve received a revelation from God and fell into sin in a single act of disobedience. Their descendants mixed with the rest of the human population, and all humans today are descended from them as well as from other humans who were alive at their time. A fifth scenario views Genesis chapters 2 and 3 as symbolic. God created humans through evolutionary processes, and as human intelligence developed over time, humanity's relationship with God also developed. God revealed himself to various people in various times and in various ways, but every time God did so, people chose to respond sinfully. Many acts of rebellion are telescoped into a single symbolic story of Genesis 2 and 3. Okay, take a moment to think about these 5 scenarios. I'll get to the theology in a minute, but first I'm going to briefly summarize some of the scientific evidence on human origins. Okay, in addition to those modern-looking human fossils going back 150,000 years, paleontologists have found many more fossils